Welcome to another edition of Inspired Stories, where leaders share their experiences so we can learn from their successes, how they've overcome adversity, and explore current challenges they're facing.
Welcome to another edition of the Inspired Stories podcast, where leaders share their experiences so we can learn from their successes and be inspired by how they've overcome adversity. My name is Anthony Codispoti, and today's guest is Howard Wu, co-owner of Aspen Leaf Preschool, a daycare and early childhood education center with 4 locations in San Diego, California. They pride themselves on much better student-teacher ratios and focus on something called continuity of care, which we'll hear more about. Their classrooms are designed to promote cooperative play and exploration in a calm, home-like environment where children feel comfortable and safe. They're given access to a variety of learning centers where they build, play pretend, investigate science themes, make art, or read. We'll hear more about why they put such a big emphasis on play-based learning and positive discipline. And before we get into all that good stuff, today's episode is brought to you by my company, Add Back Benefits Agency, where we offer very specific and unique employee benefits that are both great for your team and fiscally optimized for your bottom line. One recent client was able to add over $900 per employee per year to their bottom line by implementing one of our proprietary programs. Results vary for each company, and some organizations may not be eligible. To find out if your company qualifies, contact us today at addbackbenefitsagency.com. Now, back to our guest today, the co-founder of Aspen Leaf Preschool, Howard. I appreciate you making the time to share your story today.
Happy to be here. Good morning, Anthony.
So, tell us a little bit about the journey of getting to starting a daycare. We talked a little bit about this in the pre-interview offline. I want people to hear it's kind of an interesting path.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of fast forward a bit, basically I was in law school. I mean, that was kind of my path, right? And when I was in law school, about a month before I graduated, I was set up on a blind date with my now wife, Bridget. She was teaching preschool at the time. We quickly moved out to San Diego together. I was starting at a big firm. She was teaching preschool out here, and pretty quickly it just became clear that she was the world's greatest preschool teacher. And it was just one of those things where, you sort of say, hey, you should own your own school. You're really good at this, right? And those conversations just became more serious. And pretty quickly, we just decided, yeah, let's do it. And so we looked around, we found our first location, just signed the lease on it, and tried to open. And it was one of those things where, we were pretty naive, didn't realize how hard or expensive it would be. And I think if we'd known, we probably wouldn't have tried. But once that lease was signed and we were locked in for 5 years, then it was really just, the only way is forward, right? So every problem that came up, we just had to solve. And it just felt like there was no choice. And that first location, we got it open, successful. And then a few years later, opened our second location, and that was a real trial. But to answer your question, how did I go from lawyer to preschool owner? I never would have expected it for myself, but it was just because, I happened to marry the world's greatest preschool teacher.
And how many years had Bridget been a preschool teacher before you opened up your first location?
A good number of years, but it actually goes back to her being the second of 12 kids. So she had been sort of raising kids in effect since she was, 4 or 5. And I think that's where just a lot of instinct and kind of her natural abilities and natural empathy and just her personality kind of came out, where even as a young kid, right, she was making teeth brushing time fun for her little siblings, right? She'd set up a little store like in the bathroom with the different toothpaste they could choose. And so it was just, so that experience, I think for her, it's not just about being a teacher, but it really runs deep to just being around and working with children and interacting with them and understanding kids from a really young age.
And then, so how long was she actually in a center before?
That's
so she had
at least a decade. Yeah,
a decade.
Yeah,
okay.
A decade or more. I mean, she got her first job, pretty young. What's 18 or 19 or whatever the legal age is, right? At a Bright Horizons large center, and so that's where she that's where she got her first preschool experience.
And that's certainly helpful that she had that experience with so many younger siblings and being nurturing and caring and making learning fun for them. That then to go and have 10 years working in a formal daycare center where she got to see how things were run, right? She got to understand the structure and see like, okay, here's how they onboard, here's how they do the paperwork. And so she had a lot of really practical knowledge to pull from when you guys decided to open your first center.
Yeah, that's right. And she had she'll talk about, she had a great mentor when she first started, right? The more senior teacher in the classroom where she started. And that was the big thing is working in a school, just learning classroom management, right? Because obviously the kind of structure of a classroom is very different from just being around kids in your home or with family. But I think, the biggest thing is, there are a lot of kind of positive and negative experiences over her career as a teacher. And so when we decided to create Aspen Leaf, she created a school where she would want to work as a teacher, right? Where, I can remember how heartbreaking it was for her. She would, it was really hard when, basically the school would take one of her students away from her. Not in a malicious way, but a lot of schools are set up where, hey, this is the 2-year-old classroom, this is the 3-year-old classroom. And there are a lot of places where, on the kid's birthday, they turn 3, they just move them right over. And it seems like there's not enough thought given to how that affects the kid, right? They've made those connections with their classmates and with their teachers, and that transition can be hard, but it can also be hard on the teacher who really forms these connections. And so Aspen Leaf, again, was a place where she would want to work, where the teachers are given ownership of their classroom and the relationships with the kids and the families, but also where the school is kind of supporting them. Like I remember early on when we were dating, she said she wasn't available one Saturday because she had to go paint her classroom. And I was like, you have to, that's part of your job. They make you paint the classroom. And she said, no, I just want it a different color. And I said, are they paying you? And she said, no, but they're giving me the paint. That was the kind of teacher she was, where she was always just thinking about her kids and what she wanted to do for them. She just really wanted to take ownership of that classroom space. And so we look for teachers who were kind of cut from that same cloth.
I think part of what you were just describing a moment ago, Howard, is this idea of the continuity of care and how that was a really important component of what you guys wanted to build into Aspen Leaf and the student experience there.
Yeah, exactly. So continuity of care. We're not, we didn't originate it, but it's pretty uncommon. But basically, right. So we have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. Our 5-year-old is, in a month is going to start kindergarten. But so to take our 5-year-old, for example, he started at Aspen Leaf when he was an infant. And well, for complicated licensing reasons, I don't have to go into, but basically from when he was really young, he had these 2 teachers in his class, and that group, those teachers and those students have stayed together for 5 years, from kind of being babies all the way up to going to kindergarten. And they've moved physically classrooms, but that group has stayed together. And obviously, teachers will leave, they'll move away. So it's not always perfect, but the model, what we're striving for is for a group of kids to stay with the same teachers throughout their entire experience in the preschool. And that has really allowed them to form these really tight bonds and get to know each other and just grow and develop. And when it works, it's really magical.
That's fascinating. When I first saw continuity of care mentioned on your website, I assumed that meant that just the students stayed together. And kind of like in a traditional elementary school, they all move from 1st grade to 2nd grade, but it's a new teacher each year. And what you're saying is, no, those students all stay together and they stay with the same teacher, assuming that there isn't staff turnover in that position.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. With all those kind of assumptions and sort of real life the caveats. That is what we strive for, is for that pod, those teachers and those students to all stay together as a group throughout their entire preschool experience.
And why do you think that is such an uncommon approach in preschool and daycares?
Well, it's logistically difficult. This actually gets to something that I've not understood about kind of other preschools or the industry or the model in general. And I think what sets us apart a bit with Bridget having had the experience of being a teacher and that background, and we're very teacher focused, right? Like, because the teachers are the school. Is there a lot of things that we do that feel obvious? Because this is one of those things where everyone's interests are aligned, right? Like, if you have a good team who feel supported, the kids have a good experience. If the kids have a good experience, the families are happy. And so things like continuity of care, just kind of protecting the teachers, making them feel supported, all of it helps the classrooms and the business, right? There's no tension. So I actually don't know why more schools don't do, for example, continuity of care. But I do know from experience that a lot of schools actually aren't owned by teachers, right? And I think there are just these like models that just seem easier, right? You've got a classroom, this is the teacher in the classroom, different licensing reasons, and so you kind of shuttle the kids in. And so I think in that respect, we're a little different, where we were really focused on building a great school kind of from how that would look as a teacher.
Do you think it has anything to do with how a lot of daycare centers will have different student-teacher ratios at different age groups? And is that something that is employed in your organization as well?
So, well, we have different ratios. I mean, number one, we're licensed by the state. And so there are state mandated ratios, and these are minimums, right? And so if you go into any preschool infant classroom in California, you have to see at least a 4-to-1 ratio of infants to teachers, right? So if you walk into an infant classroom and there are 5 infants with 1 teacher, well, they're out of ratio, so they're not following the regulation. But then again, across any state, once you go into the toddler classroom, that state mandated ratio is 6-to-1, and then you get into preschool, which is kind of 2 years old and up, and then the state minimum ratio is 12-to-1. So everyone's operating with the same kind of ratios, and then ours, as a practical matter, our ratios are lower, right? Like, for example, our 5-year-olds, most of our preschool classrooms have around 10 or 11 kids with 2 teachers. These are the preschool classrooms, so we're kind of around 5-to-1 when the state minimum is 12-to-1. But that doesn't prevent us from doing continuity of care, right? What happens is our infant class is small, and when they move into the toddler classroom, well, that opens up a couple more spots. So we just enroll a couple more kids. And then when they go up into the preschool classroom, a couple more spots open up, so we enroll a couple more kids again. So I'm not sure why continuity of care isn't kind of more prevalent across the industry.
Talk to me more about the curriculum and your overall approach to childcare and early childhood education.
Yeah, so, well, as a general matter, our main focus is on social and emotional development. And so, just to give a quick example, if you walk into an Aspen Leaf classroom, say, a toddler classroom, right? These kids are kind of pre-verbal, but beginning to, they're always beginning to understand. But, so toddler classroom, if you see 2, 18-month-olds get into some small dispute, right? One is playing with some blocks, another one takes a block, and that causes the first child to cry. You'll often, you'll hear a teacher get down on their level and just narrate for the kids what's happened, right? Oh, Jack, I see you're upset because you were playing with the blocks, and then Adam took a block and that didn't feel good. Adam, do you see Jack is crying? Right? And so at that age, it's giving them the words and just kind of, again, narrating what's happening. And then a little bit older, that continues, but once they're verbal, you give them the words, right? So it's the same thing. Oh, I see you're upset because Adam took your block. Jack, you can say, Adam, I was playing with that, right? And then you help the kids say, Adam, I was playing with that. And then you turn to Adam and say, Adam, look, Jack is saying that he was playing with that, right? And so then, but then again, you continue, and as they get older, you get into problem solving, and it's the same situation. The same thing happens, except now you say, "Oh, I see we have a problem. Like, what are some solutions that we can think of?" And then the teacher guides them. And then, long story short, once they get to 5 years old, they're about to go up to kindergarten. The most amazing thing is when you look over at a couple of kids who are playing and a problem arises, and you hear one of the kids say, they say what happened, like, hey, I was playing with that. Like, we need to find a solution, right? And so that's really our focus. So in terms of curriculum, what we utilize is what's called emergent curriculum. So to contrast, if you go into some schools and you say, hey, can you show me your curriculum for the year? They could pull out a calendar and they could say, next week we're doing leaves. The week after that, we're going to do boats. The week after that, we're doing sea animals or whatever it is. Our curriculum is emergent, which means it's not set, but it emerges based on what the kids are interested in. And the example I always go to is when Bridget was teaching, she had a group of kids playing in the block area, and she got down on their level and just said, oh, can you tell me about what you're building? And one of the kids said rocket ships. And so you ask the questions, the preschool teacher questions, like, oh, like, where does a rocket ship go? Like, what does a rocket ship do? And they didn't really know, but there was, and so from the kids' perspective, over the next few days, all of a sudden the classroom becomes filled with, now there's some books about space, right? The sensory bin has some different kind of space and astronaut related things in it. And so again, the curriculum kind of emerges. And so you sort of naturally fall into this unit about space until, the kids' interest kind of naturally wanes. And in that way, you help build the kids' love of learning, and like they begin to associate school with like just this place where when they're interested in something, they show up and that interest is just explored, right? So it becomes a really, again, just magical, like engaging place for the kids.
Learning through play.
Exactly.
Learning through, what they're interested in.
Yeah, and it takes teachers who are cut from a certain cloth, right? Because there are no worksheets, and this is a question we often get from families, like, oh, how are they going to learn their numbers and letters? And we talk first about how actually the kids who succeed in elementary school and beyond are not necessarily, there's basically no association between reading and counting early and academic success in elementary school, but there is a strong correlation between emotional and social maturity and that success, because kids will learn how to read and count and do all those things, but a kid who goes into elementary school being able to identify their feelings, being able to tell people like how they're feeling, to like set boundaries and say, I need space, or I didn't like that, that kid's really set up to succeed, just sort of in the context of school. And so we start with that, but then we also go on, but the kids do learn sort of the more academic things, but it's built through play, right? And so, for example, you might have sorting activities where, again, with the space thing, there are a bunch of little tiny like space related toys, but maybe they have to sort it by color, right? There's given these like different bins, and the books that they're reading are about space, and so that gets them more into the kids are reading more because these are books that they've already shown interest in the topic, and so it takes teachers cut from a certain cloth because they have to be really creative and mindful and thinking ahead in terms of how to build all these things in, sort of as you're moving along.
Let's take a step back to the beginning for a moment, Howard. When you were first starting, I'm curious, how did you get the capital to start this? Was it self-funded? Did you take some outside investment?
Self-funded. So like I mentioned, when we moved out, I started working. I graduated law school, so I was working at a large firm, like making good money, especially for that, for being 25, right? And so we saved up a bit. Frankly, we didn't save up enough. Like I said, if we had known how hard and expensive it was going to be, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So we borrowed a little bit of money from my parents, but not too much. I think, we went in, I think we'd saved up $30,000 or $40,000, which just seemed like a, huge pot of money for us, like this is a huge pile, but, at the time, now it sounds super cheap, but, the place we found to rent is, $4,500 a month or something like that. And then we're getting supplies and just paying rent while we were building it out and painting and doing all of those things, that money kind of dwindled quickly. And then this was not, there was this strange, now I could just complain about the licensing agency for a while, but like there was this strange thing where, when we were getting licensed, In California, you're required to send them like a budget. And it was weird because it's like this fairly paternalistic, right? Like you're just licensing us, right? You're just ensuring that there's like, we meet minimum standards of health and safety. But there's all this paperwork, so we send it off. And then you have to give them permission to look in your bank account. And it's like, well, why? And they said, well, we want to see that you can survive for at least 3 months. But the amount of money they wanted to see in the bank account was like basically 3 times the expenses in this budget. And for us, we didn't have that money. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. And I tried to explain to them, well, if the goal is that you want us to be able to stay alive for 3 months, like this is not the number you're looking for, because this budget assumes we're full, right? Like fully enrolled, which means we've got all these teachers we're hiring. But I told them on day one, we're not hiring 7 teachers when we have 0 kids, right? We're going to do that work ourselves. So you shouldn't include this in the number.
And
really,
labor is a huge portion of your operating
it's
expense.
The biggest portion. And we're just not going to be spending that, if we're not full. And if we're full, that means we're making money. And so we're definitely surviving, right? But it's not even like, I would have accepted it if the employee had just said, you know what, I hear you, but like, this is what I'm told, I don't make the rules. Like, I just got to go through my checklist. Fair enough. But they didn't even accept kind of like the logic of the point that I was trying to make, right? They weren't even conceding like that I had a point. They were just like, you're just wrong. And so anyway, but it was this weird thing where, okay, so we don't have the money. So what, you're going to deny us a license because we don't have the money, but we're locked into this lease. We've already bought all the furniture. We've already painted this place. So you're going to deny us a license so we can't operate. So you're just going to drive us into personal bankruptcy because we didn't have enough money to show you this like arbitrary amount. Apparently, yes. And so, so basically what we were, fortunately, like, my family is not wealthy, but, they were in a position to at least where they could send us some cash for like literally 3 days, where I just called.
Just so you could show the bank
so
account,
I could show that,
snapshot of it in time.
Exactly. So I explained the situation, and, my family was like, okay, yeah, like we can send you, whatever it was, like $90,000, $100,000 to just hold on to for 3 days. Like, yeah, we're not spending it. And then, so we wired it in. So the number was there. The agency took a look. They were like, okay. And then I just sent it back.
Well, sometimes you got to game the system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You got to know the game to play.
Yeah.
And so from the early days, you were still continuing to practice law as the center was open. Were you actively involved in the operations of it, or did that fall mostly on Bridget?
I've always been actively involved in sort of the back end aspects of it, right? So from the beginning, payroll, receipts, bookkeeping. I learned WordPress to like set up the website. I learned a bit of SEO to figure out, the Google Maps listings and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't have a single, ECE, early childhood education credit to my name. So like I can't, teach. Bridget's always been the heart and soul of the school, of the program, right? So when you're talking about curriculum, basically anything, the actual experience for the kids has always been Bridget. But any of that kind of like background architecture, right? Like, I found our insurance broker, the workers, all that kind of stuff, I've always kind of handled or helped with. And so in that sense, we make a really good team.
Yeah, you handle a lot more of the back office, the admin, maybe a little bit more like the business side of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you've already touched on this a little bit, and I'm kind of curious to explore this a bit more. Sort of the difficulties in those first months of opening this first center. Like if we had known how hard it was going to be, we probably wouldn't have done it. Tell me about some of those difficulties, those hardships that you guys came across that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, well, so actually, I mean, those first months were, I would say, about as hard as we expected, right? I mean, Bridget was teaching, and the director went. So when we formally opened, right, like we can have kids here that we can care for. On day one, we had 3 kids enrolled, right? So Bridget was the teacher. She was the director of the location. She was also going out and buying all the supplies, right? The snack supplies, the furniture. We were doing everything, and she was marketing, right? We had printed out flyers and posters, and she was going around to coffee shops, and she was working really hard. But that all, I think, was what we expected going in. And because it's a good school, but I mean, primarily because there's just not nearly enough childcare in San Diego, like a lot of places. We filled up pretty quickly. And it's hard to like explain, but it's folks who own businesses. It's just hard. It's just constant. You're thinking about it 7 days a week. All the problems are your problems, right? If a problem doesn't get solved, you have, there are these problems that come up where it's just either you solve it or the business is going to die. And so you feel like you have no choice. And so it's hard to kind of convey just the constancy of it all, right? And it's one of those things where, we hired teachers, right, as we needed them. But Bridget especially would get to a point where she would just hit kind of a boiling point, or not. That doesn't sound right. She wasn't angry, but just a point where like I can't.
It's just too much.
Sustain it. It's too much, right? Yeah, and so having to let things go and delegate. I mean, these are sort of the classic small business owner problems. We went through. But so those first few months were about as hard as we expected, right? You just expect that hustle. But it's also fresh. And so I think the hardest thing is, a year or two, a few years later, when a lot of those grinds are still just grinding, right? To just be able to sustain that, keep it going, is hard.
Was there any point in those first couple of years where you guys seriously considered just throwing in the towel?
No, never.
That's too much. You saw that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was enough joy in some of the day-to-day that kept you going?
Yeah, well, I mean, number one, we had signed a lease, right? And we had signed personal guarantees on that. So there was really no choice. And I think that has really been the theme of the business, frankly, is that at every stage, we've just faced these inflection points where there's no choice. We just have to keep going. We just have to like either fix this problem. We have to find the money. We have to, in our second location, which we can talk about, which was really the crusher for me. There's just, you just don't have a choice. Like you have to fix this. You have to succeed. You have to push forward. You have to move. You just have to keep it going. And that, from where I'm sitting today, I can look back and appreciate those things, right? Because it's given me just a lot of, grit and confidence and the ability to persevere. But in the moment, man, those things are tough. But no, quitting was just never an option.
So, and I hear you, when the first location was there, a big part of the reason that quitting wasn't an option is you had this 5-year lease that you'd personally guaranteed. There was no out. We're going to make this work. At what point did the first location feel successful enough that you guys were like, let's replicate this. Let's open up a second one?
Yeah. So our first location opened, October 1st, 2012. We signed the lease on the second location kind of, if I'm recalling, January 2015, which was actually the same month that our first son was born. So I think, within a year and a half of opening the first location, we felt like we had kind of our feet under ourselves, right? Like, it was a great preschool. The family's really happy. Like you could just walk in and it was just this happy place. Right. I mean, you have all the normal problems. It's a hard business to own. Right. Like kids are predictable, but unpredictable, right? They're unpredictable in predictable ways. It's a low paid workforce. It's expensive for the families. It's brick and mortar, like all those challenges, but you'd walk into the preschool or the kids would leave and like, you could just see their development. And if you talk to good preschool teachers, all of them will tell you that's why they do it, right? Like the impact they're having on the kids. It's because they're so young and growing so fast. It's so apparent. It's so visceral. Like just I can remember, Bridget, some of the teachers would have this song when they're cleaning up the classroom, right? Clean up, everybody, everywhere, clean. And then, they're doing it and the kids are the 2-year-olds are just kind of, but then when you see a 2.5, 3-year-old just like cleaning up their little station and you just see them singing to themselves, clean up, it just warms your heart, right? Like you are having an impact.
You're making a difference.
You're making a difference. And, the number of parents who would come to not just Bridget, but, their kids' teachers, right? And just say, I don't know how you do it, or they have a story about their kids at home and it's, they pick something up at school, that impact, that, and it's just very real and it's very immediate because of how quickly the kids are developing. And so, yeah, it's the hardest, best thing we've ever done, right? Because even from the beginning, like that impact, it was clearly a special place.
And so pretty early on, we got our arms around this. This is a great preschool. We want to open up a second location. Talk me through how that unfolded then.
Yeah, I mean, this story, we could spend hours on it. But again, like we had not lost a lot of that naivete that got us into the first location, where we were like, oh yeah, we could do this, So the first location it still is in an old house here in San Diego, and we kind of retrofitted it, and did things, but structurally it is what it is, right? We didn't move. We just like the living room, the dining room. These are classrooms now, right? The second location, Bridget wanted to open a second location that was a little bit bigger so that we could have infants and toddlers, and she would say the main reason was because we were married at that point. We were planning on having a family. She wanted to send her baby, like she wouldn't trust anyone else to care for her babies, right? Like she wanted to be in charge of where our kids were going to school. And so we were thinking about it, planning it. Long story short, we found a location that was great, which is where our second location currently is. But they wouldn't lease it to us. They leased it to because it's this commercial building. It was an old laundromat, right in a neighborhood called North Park, but it's not in this commercial corridor. Like it's just this weird kind of thing where it's right on this corner, and across the street is like a little convenience store, liquor store, and flower shop. But those are the only two commercial businesses like within several blocks, and it's all homes around. So you've got this perfect commercial space, but it feels very residential, right? It's got this big parking lot, which we did turn into a playground. So it was just this like impossible location. So we really wanted it, but the landlords leased it to a spot that was going to turn it into like a little microbrewery restaurant or something. We heard that it became clear that they were not going to be able to get a liquor license. And so they like pulled out, and the landlord, kind of came back to us, or I can't remember how it happened, but basically like on the second go around, they agreed to lease it to us. This spot, when we moved in, like I said, it was a former laundromat. But when we moved in, it was 4 walls, barely a roof, and nothing. So at the end of the day, like every pipe and tube and wire and floorboard and section of drywall and light in that place, we installed, right? So this was a huge, kind of like construction project. It's a huge, I mean, the building's pretty small, 2,700 square feet, just a rectangle, 1 floor, right? But like, we did not appreciate how huge this project was going to be. To like be a little sort of, I don't know, vague, for legal reasons, I can't get into some of the problems we had with the folks we hired to kind of design and engineer the place. But I will say, I got a crash course in, basically just commercial construction, right? Everything from design and planning to permitting, right? Mechanical, electrical, plumbing, roofing, all of that. And I also, the biggest lesson I took from that point was I had to learn the hard way about vetting people you hire, and how dangerous of a combination overconfidence and undercompetence is. Like that's a really dangerous combination in a person. But to kind of, we thought within 9 months of signing the lease we'd be able to be open. It was almost 2 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and there was we negotiated some TI reimbursement, right, tenant improvement reimbursement, and there was some stuff there, but the process was so long and so expensive that we got an SBA loan. We also learned that after this opening up this memory box is bringing out a lot of different stories, but I can remember the day when I did that kind of cash transfer from your credit card, our personal credit card, right? I put I just transferred $25,000 of cash from one of our credit cards into the business account in order to make payroll at the first location that was still going on. And what is that at 35-40% interest, right? Whatever those are. And we were just tapped out. We had started with the kind of very legitimate SBA loan that we thought would be enough. And then we kind of went into the more dodgy kind of business loans, all to just keep the construction going, to keep operating. We were, liquidated our retirement savings, which wasn't a lot at that point, but I was still working at the big firm, at the firm. Liquidate all of our savings for a few years separately. I had been really into churning credit card points, right? I was doing the miles and points things, just right. There were just people who do that. And so through that process, I just amassed $180,000 of personal credit, all in the service of kind of getting us free flights and free hotels and things. And we ended up maxing out pretty much all of that. We were just totally underwater. I think rationally, somebody just a cold accountant looking at the numbers, I'm confident would have just looked at these at everything at an earlier stage and just said, you've got to pull the plug. You just got to abandon this. You have to declare personal bankruptcy. You're done. You can't keep digging this hole deeper. But we just felt like we didn't have a choice. I mean, it was never even an option, but there were some really dark days. And the darkest was...
what you're describing is incredibly stressful. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, this was, to be candid, I can remember in August of 2016. I mean, at this point, things are done. We had scraped and clawed, and we had it this building was built. It was furnished. It was painted. There was kids' furniture. There were toys there, right? We were trying to get licensed. And we were trying to get through our final kind of things with the city. And we tried to set up the final city inspection, and they came out, or they didn't come out. They said, hey, you've got all these special inspections still in the plans that haven't been cleared. I was like, what does that mean? They're like, well, you got to check these off. And I talked with our contractor, and the contractor said, yeah, these are here, but they don't relate to anything. For example, they were like, look, they're requiring a special inspection for welding. And a special inspection, just for context, is when you hire an inspector to come out and watch you do the thing that needs to be inspected, right? So there was a special inspection on the plans for welding, where when something's welded, you're supposed to hire this person to come out, watch you weld, and say, okay, you've welded this correctly. I'm going to sign off on this. The contractor walked me through the plans, and he said, there's not a single weld in this entire place. And so I went down to the city. At this point, I was running the plans on my own, just sitting and, pulling the numbers, sitting there for hours. And for that one, for example, I was just desperate. I was like, please, just look at these plans. There's not a weld in this place. And so I found, a guy who was finally willing to listen to me at the city. And he went through and he, cleared ones that okay, yeah, this is fair. Yeah, I don't know why this is here. But there was a special inspection for concrete, and we poured a lot of concrete. And there was a very real chance as I was sitting here, that he was going to tell me, I cannot sign off on these plans. You cannot get these, you cannot get you cannot get this project approved unless you rip out the flooring and the walls. Wow. And and you jackhammer the concrete, like in the foundation, and re-pour it with a special inspector. And at this point, like I said, I mean, we were hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, personally and the business. And I just begged. And we were dealing with this. And I can tell you, like, those months, when all this kind of was going on, I had what, I spent a lot of time talking with my therapist. Yeah, I started therapy at the time. And I was like, I'm not having suicidal thoughts, I don't think, but I'm thinking about like the idea of suicide, just the concept, And she said, well, this is what, this is the difference between suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts, right? We didn't have a gun, right? A suicidal thought is when you think, hey, I've got this extension cord, in my garage, and I could tie it to this thing, and I could, it never got to that point. But I was thinking about, if this doesn't work, like, what am I going to do? Do I just, and that was really hard. Yeah. But there's a happy, obviously, we've got, now it's 2024. We didn't have to rip out everything. Basically, I found a guy who's just willing to listen and work with me at the city. And at the end of the day, we had to cut open 2 relatively small sections of walls, hire a special inspector to watch us kind of reinstall a few lag screws. He signed off on it. And we were able to open, but we had weeks, if not days, of runway left in terms of just being able to like meet payroll at the other location. Because again, we're still paying rent on this place, and it was expensive. We were just tapped out.
Howard, I appreciate you opening up and sharing that, because that clearly that brought up a lot of old experiences, a lot of old emotions there, very raw. And these are things that people don't often hear or know about, right? They see the beautiful daycare centers. If people go to your website, they can see just these gorgeous facilities, and they're like, oh, these guys must be rolling in cash. He's an attorney. I'm sure he's sitting on a whole boatload of money. Things just come easy to him. And to hear, this real struggle that you guys went through, almost went belly up, like a lot of personal strife, the therapy that you've gone through to come through the other side. I really appreciate you opening up about that. And I'm curious, so you guys went from 1 location to 2 locations. Now you're at 4 locations. And as you go through that kind of growth, it really changes the way that the founders are involved with the business, right? When you're a
Absolutely.
Small location, your wife, Bridget, she's the teacher, she's the director, she's everything. Now you're at a 2nd location. Now you're at 4 locations. A lot of times you end up being more removed from the things that, especially for Bridget, that she, was really good at and really enjoys. I'm kind of curious to hear both of you, how your roles have changed as you've gone through that growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know Bridget would tell you, she hates her job right now. She, like, the thing that she loved was teaching. Like she wishes she could be a teacher at Aspen Leaf. Because it was, again, making those like having her kids, right? That's what she loves. We love Aspen Leaf. Like, I don't want to say she hates her job, but now it's a lot of admin.
She's not doing the parts of it that she used to love.
Exactly. She lost the parts that she loved about teaching, and that's been really hard. And so, we've grown and had to delegate, right? So, like, in addition to the teachers for the classrooms, each location has a director, right? We now have an enrollment coordinator because that was another thing where for years she was doing all enrollment, and so that meant reaching out to families on the wait list and communicating with them, giving them tours, emailing back and forth, like kind of like talking about all that kind of stuff. And so that's been a big thing, is just learning to delegate. For me, my role hasn't necessarily changed. I think like the responsibilities have stayed consistent for me, right? But even there, I've also had to learn kind of the beauty of delegation and just finding efficient systems and processes. Like in the early days when we, at Hillcrest, when we had at most kind of like 6 employees, it was really quick and easy for me to do payroll. We immediately got a payroll service, but I would just get their timesheets. I would just tabulate their times, enter it in, and it was fine. Once we got to 50, We had kind of gone to the T sheets, right? Like, but I was still having to like tabulate things and figure out little discrepancies. So it took me a surprisingly long time to just realize like, oh, I should just teach each director how to like calculate payroll for their location. Right. And so now they can send me hours and I can, now it's just data entry. Right. And so, yeah, it's just for me, same responsibilities, but things have just kind of grown. And then over time, in the beginning, we didn't offer health insurance. That was very uncommon just across the field, right? Like in 2012, if you went to any preschool, almost none of them would offer like health insurance, for example. But a few years later, we wanted to do it, and it was becoming more common. So, in order to kind of recruit, I had to learn kind of about that. Had some experience going through a few brokers until we found one who really worked. So, things have, as you grow, you kind of add things on like that. But my role hasn't changed too much.
You actually touch on something I usually like to ask a question around this. Retaining, recruiting good staff nowadays with labor shortage is really difficult. You guys have been able to introduce health insurance recently as a way to help with that. I'm curious some other things that you've tried which have worked.
This is, this is the biggest problem, not just for us, but like for preschools in general. It is a tragedy. It is a travesty that preschool teachers across the United States, like in this country, are basically the lowest paid profession. Right? We've set up our education system in a really strange way. K through 12. I mean, with all the problems and issues that folks go into about public school systems, it is a public system, right? And those teachers are underpaid, but preschool teachers are underpaid even compared to their elementary school counterparts because it's basically entirely private, and this is not kind of by design. It's just like we've just fallen into this situation where for years it has been too expensive for families, teachers are underpaid, and preschools barely make money. I mean, this is a really low margin, zero growth, high fixed cost business. And so right now, even though there are only half the number of childcare spots in our county, in San Diego County, that the county needs, 75% of schools either break even or lose money. And because it's just too expensive to run. So you're getting these childcare deserts where just the cost of opening a school and operating at the minimum ratios, what you'd have to charge for that, the families in those neighborhoods just can't afford. But to get back to the recruiting, cost of living in San Diego is a huge problem. A decade ago, we had a lot of teachers who lived pretty close to the schools. And just over time, as the cost of living has increased, people who want to be preschool teachers just haven't been able to afford to live in this city. We lose most of our teachers to just moving. Either moving farther out of San Diego or different states entirely, right? Texas, Colorado, back home or whatever. And so that's been a huge challenge overall, like for the field, especially in this area. For us specifically, like how do we attract and retain the best teachers? What we strive for is to create, again, we've always been teacher focused, right? Bridget's a teacher. This goes back to just the heart of Aspen Leaf, which is like we are a preschool by teachers for teachers. Obviously for the kids, but again, the teachers are the school. And so I think, we have had and have a reputation among teachers in the area where if you want to do this job, there's no better place to do it than Aspen Leaf. The small class size is just the support, right? And I don't know what rating this podcast is, but we're a place where the shit rolls uphill with us, right? If parents are being difficult, if they're being unreasonable, Bridget or I will meet with them, and we're really communicative, like we'll work it out. But at the end of the day, we'll say, you know what, this isn't a good fit. You got to go. And we have our teachers back.
So you'll actually fire families. You'll tell
Yeah.
parents,
and
thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we this is another thing. Like we do not expel kids. I mean, there are schools where if a kid is just, I don't, they're not difficult, but there's some challenging behaviors. There are a lot of schools that just say we're not going to deal with this. But for us and for Bridget, those are the kids she's always loved the most. She'll say those are the kids who need us. The families we have expelled, almost 100% has been because of parent misbehavior. Or it's clear it's not the right fit for the parents. And so
employees know that you've got their back.
Yeah, and
they're not going to have to put up with abusive parents.
Yeah, and a lot of teachers, who have worked at a lot of different schools, that's what they tell us. And we've heard a lot of stories of times where they were, the school kind of threw them under the bus or undermined them with the parents, and their feeling was, well, because the parents are the ones paying the money. But again, this is one of those things where I don't understand it, because it is better for the staff, better for the school, better for the business, if you protect your teachers, right? Because if they're happier, you're going to lose that one family, but you're going to create a culture where the teachers feel supported and want to stay, and that's happier for the kids, right? And so then the families who are there are happier, and they spread the gospel in their neighborhood, and you're getting all that inbound, you just build a good reputation. And so that's something I've never understood.
Yeah. What's the future of Aspen Leaf, Howard? Where do you see it going from here?
Well, we want to keep being Aspen Leaf. This is, we've had, culture is just so hard, right? And it's always self-reinforcing, positively or negatively. When things have been good, when we've had a team with chemistry, you get fewer call outs, right? They're supporting each other, but we've had times with, we've hired, we've had folks who should have fired sooner. We've had kind of bad chemistry. And so this is not a business that you can ever walk away from. It never gets automated. It's just too many people. And it's too hard. And so the future of Aspen Leaf is we just keep working hard to keep the standards up, to keep the experience going. Because it's a good preschool. We just want to, we want to just keep owning good preschools. But
you guys have built a good model, and you want to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. But there are macro challenges that I don't know, that we can't solve. Like I said, there's no public support for us. We don't get any taxpayer money. And so, for example, Hillcrest, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, we had 29 spots, right? That's our license. We can have 29 kids per day. Today, same building, our license is still 29 kids, right? It's based on the square footage. And so that location cannot grow. It's just, it's a building. But in that time, right, teacher compensation has more than tripled, right? Rent has more than doubled. The cost of all the supplies has increased, right? Milk and crackers and all those things. And so we've had to increase tuition. Again, 12 years ago, it was about $1,000 a month to send your kid to Aspen Leaf. In September, for same age, it's going to be over $2,500 a month. Because again, for that location, for example, we need tuition from 29 families to support all of this, right? And at some point, it's wages are going to keep going up. All these things are going to keep going up. At some point, families aren't going to be able to afford it. So in 5 years, I'm not sure what the preschool and childcare industry looks like. If you kind of Google it, people are talking about this cliff, right? This crisis, the business model is collapsing. There are already, as I said, places in San Diego in the country that are childcare deserts because you just can't open one, right? The families just can't afford it. It just can't exist despite the demand. So there's got to be some kind of change because this is
I
unsustainable.
was going to say, is there a solution on the horizon? Is there a proposed fix?
No,
and it happen.
Well, the proposed fix is very expensive, right? Like it's got you've got like taxpayers. The government has to support it in the same way that we support elementary school education, right? Because the current kind of system of it's just too patchy, right? There are some families who are eligible for subsidy, but they're hard, they're difficult. There's a long wait list. It's not nearly widely enough available. You got to support these things publicly. But we're actually going somewhat backwards, where in California, we're doing an excellent thing, right? It's called universal TK or universal pre-K, where basically the state is trying to add a grade below kindergarten, right, for 4-year-olds. And it's a good thing. The problem is they're only funding it in the public schools. There were proposals, it's called mixed delivery, right? Like we want every family with a 4-year-old in California to be able to send their child to school either for free or low cost. So some people said, well, let's create these classrooms in the public schools, but let's also fund private preschools to be able to, offer these spots at a discount. Or for free to those families, and that would be excellent. But instead, they're only funding it in public schools, and now there are these problems where they don't have enough teachers and enough classrooms. So we're not offering it to all families, right? So there's still that shortage. But at the same time, it's hollowed out enrollment for private preschools because now you're losing all your 4-year-olds to the free program. And I've had a lot of discussions with families where they say, we love you guys. We would absolutely stay. But the difference between, $30,000 a year and free, that's a huge difference. And I fully understand that. But even then, there's a difference in quality. And so we've had families come back. But so anyway, there's all these problems where, we have seen like this past year was hard because that demand for that 4-year-old kind of age range was just absolutely decimated. And so, we're having to evaluate, do we just not, so for this coming school year, we're taking what was kind of normally known as the 4-year-old classroom, and we're doing it mixed age, right? And there are a lot of benefits to mixed age. But yeah, there were times where, we had a classroom with like, which you could have 11 students in, and we had, 3 or 4 4-year-olds. And so we're actually kind of going backwards in this where, at least our state is actually making it harder for private preschools to stay open, and a lot are closing because of what the state is doing to try to expand access, which is a laudable goal, which we support. But the way they're doing it is just decimating the demand.
Yeah, it seems like with the shortage of teachers in classrooms that they're experiencing in the state-funded program, that it would make a lot of sense to involve the private sector.
No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, because families. There are a lot of great preschools in California, and the families would love to stay, right? And it's one of those things where, okay, let's subsidize those spots. So let's create the TK programs in the public schools, which is a good thing. But we can't meet the demand for all the families in California. And so let's also fund these spots in existing preschools that are already doing this. You get a lot of families who are happy, want to stay. The other side of this is that staff are also moving from preschools to the public schools, which has always happened. But now you've got this, TK grade, so they can continue to work with 4-year-olds. They're getting these signing bonuses. Again, depending on the school, like it could be a tough situation, right? Like we've had teachers who work with us for a long time. Have always wanted to be elementary school teachers, so they go and do that, but then they come back because they love the age. But working in public schools has its own challenges. But yeah, it's just created a lot of problems, and the solution it's expensive, but it seems obvious because everyone kind of benefits.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to follow. We've had other daycare owners on from California, and we hear everybody talking about this same challenge. Some of them are they're talking about scaling back the size of the business, or maybe they're going to transition classrooms from, that 4-year-old class rate, that 4-year-old age range to, younger groups. And maybe, they'll find some balance there. But yeah, there's a lot of big things at play here that, like you said, are out of your control. I'm curious, just kind of shifting gears into something a little bit more lighthearted. What's a fun fact that most people wouldn't know about you, Howard?
The fact that gets most people to just kind of like do a double take is that there were several years in my when I was in college where I had dreadlocks.
Is that right? I'd love to see a
Yeah.
picture of that. We'll
No,
post that
yeah,
with the show notes.
I'll have to find it. But yeah, I remember my freshman year, I went on spring break with Habitat for Humanity, and there was a girl on the trip who had dreadlocks, and you kind of asked me to be vulnerable. So number one, I did think they looked cool, and so then I was like, oh, could I do that? And she was like, sure. So I just grew it out, and she did it, beeswax, and for a lot, for years when I was at Penn State, like I would meet people and they'd be like, oh, I've seen you around campus. Like you're the Asian with dreads, right? I mean, this is like 50,000 people. But I was like, I was that guy. And so, yeah, that's something people just can't believe. Like, my hair it's Asian, wiry, straight. So I'll have to find that photo. But honestly, I think
that
like, go ahead.
I was going to say that was your visual calling card. I'm going to guess it probably encouraged you to keep the dreadlocks a little bit longer than maybe you might have, because people are like, oh, I recognize you. You're the Asian with dreads.
Well, that's the thing
combo.
Is I think looking back, a lot of it was just kind of like insecurity and attention seeking. Like I think, I'd always, like when I was in high school, I had really horrible acne. I mean, that was like honestly one of the biggest challenges of my life, like just dealing with that. And like, I grew up in Pittsburgh. Like, I was one of 4 Asian kids in my school. Like, it was just a very white area, great school. But like, the barbers, they didn't really know how to deal with Asian hair. So I always had terrible hair, and I'd get made fun of. And so I was just really, I was confident in the sense that like, I was sort of the class clown, right? Like I always loved being on a stage. But really insecure kind of one-on-one and with a lot of just kind of like, especially with girls and just my appearance and stuff. So honestly, looking back, I think the dreadlocks thing was kind of like, well, let's, I've always hated my hair. I always get made fun of it. Like, let's try something really extreme. Right. And yeah, kind of get that attention as the Asian kid with dreads. Because I think just kind of digging deep, it's one of those things where like, if you're the one drawing attention to yourself, then it's not embarrassing when someone draws attention to you, and so I think it was
you
a
sort
lot
of take control of the narrative there.
No, exactly, yeah.
Howard, I just have one more question for you, but before I do it, I want to do 2 things. First of all, if you're listening today and you like today's content, please hit the subscribe, like, or share button on your favorite podcast app. The second thing I want to do before I ask my last question is I want to let people know the best way to get in touch with you. What would that be?
Oh, yeah, if they want to, I mean, email, I suppose, Howard at aspenleafpreschool.com. Just feel free to get in touch. Also, if you're we didn't even talk about the COVID stuff, but since then I've been helping a lot of preschool. Basically, we got in a scrap with the licensing agency, and I held firm, and because I didn't think they had the legal authority to do what they were trying to do around masks. I mean, we took COVID really seriously. But masking kids just didn't make sense because they couldn't wear them when sleeping and eating. So we didn't do it, and they tried to get us in trouble. And because I was a lawyer, this is where my background came into. I was like, I've dug into this. You actually can't. You don't have the jurisdiction to enforce this. Got into a big scrap. We got cited. Anyway, it's long story short. Like, we did not go on Fox News, but like, Tucker Carlson's show ended up just like talking about us because we made the news about this stuff, about us fighting back. And we were like, well, we don't want to be like a bullet in this, like in the chamber for this like culture war. Like but anyway, after that, we had a lot of preschools in California reach out to us and just say like, hey, we're rooting for you, sharing stories of times that licensing abused their authority. And again, like I realized, there might not be another like lawyer preschool owner in California. Right. And so for the last few years, I've been like helping preschools with licensing issues and legal issues. And I kind of put together a little kit to help preschools understand how to appeal citations, because the agency gives you like a 1-page, like here are your appeal rights, but there are no instructions, no forms. They don't, people don't know what to do with it. You can hire a lawyer for thousands of dollars, but it's not worth it. There's nothing kind of in between. So if preschool owners, especially, or administrators,
what a
want
great
to reach
service.
out.
I'm glad that we touched on this. Yeah. And again, mention your email address, because I think that's going to be super helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, they can reach out at howard@aspenleafpreschool.com. But also for owners and administrators in California, if they go to appeal.californiachildcarelicensing.com, this is where I put, like, it's a little digital download, right? Just I personally wrote like a guide on, like, if I were sitting across from one of my directors, like, okay, if you get cited, here's literally how you appeal a citation. Like, here's how you do the research. Here's how you make an argument.
Oh, and this is a free resource.
It's not free. I'm charged. I'm charging for it, but it's like this again. Like, I'm trying to make like a just, it's like less than $100. And there are like templates and examples. Yeah. Like just like a genuinely helpful resource to, like, here's how to do it, and here's like some templates to put it together. Digital download. And so, yeah, because during that fight, I thought we were being treated unfairly. They said, no, we're treating you just like every other preschool. And I was like, I don't think that's true. So I just dug into every single report and citation they issued across all of California from the beginning of COVID. And I this is where the big firm training came into practice. Like, I was willing to just grind and just like throw it into spreadsheets or just do hours and hours of analysis. And I statistically proved that they were treating us unfairly. And so I bought the domain CaliforniaChildcareLicensing.com, and I wrote the whole story, and I put the data on that website, and I just made it publicly available. And I was, so that's why I own that domain.
And what's the subdomain, the full URL that somebody can go to get that packet that you talked about?
So actually, if you just go to CaliforniaChildcareLicensing.com, you can see kind of the backstory. But now, there's a link right at the top that says, like, hey, I have this kit, so if you want to appeal your own citations. So it's all, you can go to the main domain, and then that'll take you to the subdomain. But that was one of those other things where, like, I would not, like, the only reason I know how to do WordPress and like a little bit of coding and these kinds of things is from owning the business. Right. So like those skills, like I had no reason to learn that kind of stuff, but I've found it's come in handy.
That's a terrific resource. I'm glad that we touched on that. Okay, so last question for you, Howard. Are there any specific mentors, books, or experiences that have helped you shape you or your professional career that you want to give mention to?
Oh gosh, I saw this question. I should have prepared a little better because there are a bunch. But books to start with.
Give us a few.
Yeah, for the men especially. There's a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy, which at some points touches a little too close for comfort to the kind of weird men's rights movement. But for a lot of it is actually, like, for me personally, was a real game changer. I think, personally and professionally, because it just kind of touched on some mindsets that I've had for years and years and years that kind of were holding me back, right, in terms of like fear of failure and just being seen as not good enough, and kind of led to a lot of procrastination. And so in terms of just being able to like execute and run a business and work with people, like that was a really important book for me, where it just like really did kind of change my mindset and helped me with that. And then in terms of, also like Deep Work by Cal Newport. We read a lot, but that was a really important book in terms of like productivity. Now, with this, like the Licensing Appeal Kit and a couple other businesses I'm trying to start, like that has really been a game changer in terms of helping me just focus and delegate and just get a lot more done and just be productive. And then in terms of mentors, I'll just give a shout out to Cal Golumbic from Penn State, Ken Fitzgerald and Bob Nyer, who I worked with when I was still practicing law, who were really supportive. Like they were, when I was practicing law with them, like they knew I owned the business and like kind of had a foot in both worlds, and they were supportive. And so yeah, those are a few folks who are important in my life.
Terrific. I appreciate you calling them out. We'll make sure that we include their names, and if we can can find them, links to them in the show notes. Howard, I want to be the first one for thank you for sharing both your time and your story today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation. It was enjoyable. The first podcast I've ever been on.
You wouldn't have guessed it. You're a natural.
I appreciate that.
Folks, that's a wrap on another episode of the Inspired Stories podcast. Thanks for learning with us today.